Welcome to Life Science Marketing Radio, the podcast where marketing leaders inside and outside the sciences share their creative ideas and practical approaches to increasing your marketing ROI. Here's your host, Chris Connor.
Elizabeth Chabe is the CEO of High Touch Group, the author of The Giant's Ladder, the Science Professional's Blueprint for Marketing Success, and a director at the Main Venture Fund. Elizabeth, welcome.
Thanks for having me, Chris. Excited to be here.
Likewise. Okay, so today we're going to talk a little bit about marketing and science communication and how companies might be doing a bit of both, which I think is a good idea. And your whole idea around mentioning that science could be rock stars. When we spoke before, you said, how many scientists can most people name? Neil deGrasse Tyson and Albert Einstein, maybe. Living scientists, maybe one or two. So, and we need to position them better in society. So share some examples of how companies and marketers can start building this perception of scientists as cultural icons.
This is such a great question, Chris, and I'm really glad that you started us here because this is really the essence of, I think, what science marketing should be doing and where science marketing tends to fail a little bit. So this is my personal passion. How can we position scientists, and I say as rock stars, because that's just such an easy way of explaining the entire idea. How do we turn scientists into rock stars? But really what I mean by that is how do we position scientists and the work that they do as iconic, as cultural icons. And this really all starts with storytelling. So scientists, as we know, they tend to be natural problem solvers, innovators, explorers. They tend to be curious, data-driven. But these qualities often tend to be almost locked in by academic journals and sort of these traditional avenues for scientists to talk about their everyday work. That doesn't leave a lot of room for inspiring the next generation of scientists. It certainly doesn't leave a lot of room for scientists to learn more about how to communicate the value of what they do to society or the products they're developing to potential investors. So, this is a really overlooked opportunity, I think, to tell a broader story around scientists, the science they do, and how it affects all of our lives every day in so many different ways. So I'll pause there, but obviously I could talk about this forever, and I'm happy to get more into some details here if you'd like.
Yeah, and we will. So I'll throw in that yesterday as I'm scrolling through my YouTube shorts, and one of the people that comes up a lot is Neil deGrasse Tyson, and he's talking about big science, like going to the moon and how we capture the public's attention. And we don't always have those big projects now, but there is something of a vision that's needed, at least in his point of view, to connect people with what science is doing, not just now, but make them realize as they're complaining on their cell phone, driving down the road, looking at their GPS, how we don't need science.
Exactly.
Or what does science do for me?
Right. Or we're going to defund all of these agencies that are really important for making sure that we have the infrastructure in place for good quality research and development to happen at our academic and other research institutions so that it can affect our lives in positive ways on a daily basis. I think that one of the most salient examples in the life sciences is the medical affairs professionals that are employed by biopharma companies, tools companies, and others. And they very specifically don't have a marketing agenda or a sales commercialization agenda. They are just communicating and educating around the sciences. But when we think about medical affairs professionals, again, can you name many by name unless you have worked directly in a consultative capacity with that company? Right, exactly, like you and I.
I've had one on this podcast. That's the only one I know.
Right. But, these people are often brilliant because they are hired to be incredibly well versed in the type of science that company's clients need to learn more about, need to understand how the tools that company is producing are applicable to various specialty areas and so on. And so that medical affairs group really embodies in a lot of ways what we're talking about around science education and communication. But again, they're not elevated to the level that somebody like a Bill Nye, the science guy, or a Neil deGrasse Tyson, or some of these really handful of scientists who have become cultural icons have really gotten to that level.
Yeah. I want to ask, I mean, we hadn't planned on this, but I do see a lot of great science communicators on YouTube, people who are, I don't know if they're making a living, but they're doing a great job of bringing ordinary science to the people. And they may not be household names, but they're probably well known among other scientists because they tell cool stories.
Yes, yes.
How do
And
we
they
get them,
podcast.
or how do we get people in science, in business, to communicate the way they do and elevate the whole thing?
It's a good question, but I think, this sort of conversation that we're having here, I think goes really far towards that end. And also getting this desire to elevate science to that role of culture icon, or scientists to the role of cultural icon. I think it really depends on how we become famous today. Scientists like Neil deGrasse Tyson, Carl Sagan, Bill Nye, they became famous in the science age. And Neil deGrasse Tyson's a great example. Some have been able to translate that to live shows, public speaking, to documentary series on network television. They've been able to get guest appearances on Good Morning America on a recurring basis, or cable news. And of course, they have podcasts and they go on other people's podcasts. So there are a handful of people who are doing a very good job, but we need to lean in a little bit more into the ways that we communicate with the public more broadly. And this is where marketing, I think, really comes into science communication and education, making sure that science communicators and educators, just because they're really good at explaining a complex topic to a specific audience who's a non-expert, it doesn't mean that they're using the right tools. It doesn't mean that they're leveraging social media to the extent that they could. It doesn't mean that they're as polished with their podcasts, for example. And so I think that all of these things are ways that marketers can really help add a little bit of polish and, of course, reach to to the science communicators.
Yeah. All right. So let's talk about positioning the value of this to the companies. How can companies balance their brand building with contributing to that larger mission of improving public perception of science? Do you have examples of companies that do this well?
Yeah, and this is so important too, because when we think about brands, so often we're thinking about, you know, how a company is perceived, right? But a lot of that perception starts not with the brands and sort of the superficiality of the brands, but with the mission. And with a science organization, a science company, the distinction between brand building and mission building is really crucial. So a brand, I mean, everybody here knows what a brand is, that who is listening, I assume, but just in case, the way I think about a brand is it's what somebody might say about your company. If I'm talking about Chris's podcast, what might I say about your brand? But a mission's what the company stands for. You want to improve the state of life science marketing. There's a mission behind your organization. And so when science companies focus on mission building first, the brand naturally follows, but often with far greater depth and authenticity, which again, I think is very important with brand building and science companies. And science companies have such an important and unique responsibility to really lead with their mission because their work often addresses society's most pressing questions like health, climate change and sustainability, innovation. And so by rooting all of their marketing actions, or a lot of their marketing actions, in their mission, they can inspire trust and loyalty that go beyond, a single vaccine. So a great example, and I hate to use COVID as too many examples these days, but there are some really great examples that came out of that pandemic era when really so many of the stakes were against companies like Pfizer and Moderna. But Moderna really advocated and supported its mission about advancing RNA-based medicine to solve an unmet need. They focused on the mission during the pandemic. And the company really wasn't just trying to sell a vaccine. They were really advocating global health. And this commitment to sharing data openly, which Moderna did, investing in public education, which Moderna did, and partnering with governments, it reinforced their mission, and their brands naturally grew stronger as a result. When we ask, what COVID vaccine do you have? Most, especially in the United States, people know what brand vaccine they had, and there might even be brand loyalty there. And it's all rooted in the mission and these companies rising to the opportunity in a very public way.
Would you say that Moderna's, I think you did say it, but that their mission wasn't just obviously to create a vaccine for COVID, but their overall mission is to bring RNA therapies to the world and tell a bigger story. Like there's a lot of potential left here.
Exactly. And how fast they were able to do this with a new technology. That implication now in all of our minds is where else could we go with these RNA-based therapeutics and vaccines that wasn't really in the public consciousness before, and now certainly is. So it doesn't have to wait. We don't have to wait for the next public health epidemic for there to be another RNA-based vaccine that's going to have a little bit more trust, I think. And we're going to overcome some of that vaccine hesitancy that an RNA-based vaccine out of the market without the COVID pandemic kind of proving the technology out in that pressure cooker might have otherwise resulted in.
Yeah, I hope so. I had a question that just popped into my head around brand. Maybe it'll come back to me. Maybe I'll edit this whole thing out.
Either way.
Because what was it? I was thinking about building a brand. RNA. Well, maybe it will come back. Oh, I know what it was. So there's so many companies. Here's the thing, the challenge. Like that is a great mission, and they're the first ones, I will say, to land on it. I might be wrong, but I'm going to assume that they are. A lot of companies, what they're working on, particularly in therapeutics, but also even in instrumentation, are so narrow. It's hard to plant your flag on a big enough island that people notice, right?
It's talent.
So standing out, like the next RNA company, of course, they're trying to do the same thing, but in a smaller way, perhaps.
Right.
And a lot of life science companies struggle with that, right, too.
It's true. And this is where working with a strategist who can really hone in on not just your single product strategy, but your overall mission and how your marketing can align and serve that mission, as opposed to the mission sort of being an afterthought and your product being front and center. And this is complex, and this is why I mentioned working with a strategist. There are a handful of companies, Linus Agency is great at this. My company, of course, works with a small set of companies doing this. And there are others that really understand specific, nuanced markets within the life sciences or other scientific fields. And they play an important role in being a strategic advisor to these organizations and helping them elevate their marketing so that it's not just product sales oriented. I mean, that's obviously part of it. So that's often how you get a company in the door so you can do better, more strategic marketing for them. You, of course, show the revenue support first. But the idea really is that you're helping promote that mission and that everything you're doing in that organization is in service to the mission, not just your marketing.
Yeah. So let's talk about that. So the broader impacts you're looking for when you're helping companies help promote trust in science, whether it's public health or climate change. Tell me a little bit about how you think about that.
Sure. there are lots of different ways that we start this conversation with our clients, and I'm sure every agency does this differently. When I'm advising more like in a public speaking capacity or kind of more broadly, I first start by defining science communication, science education, and science marketing, because they all play a role here. And in order to understand what science marketing is and isn't and how to apply it, I think it's really important that we think about those other two aspects as well. So the way I think about it is science communication explains, education equips, and then marketing connects. So communication is about sharing knowledge, hopefully in an engaging way, and you're making it digestible for non-experts. So, for example, maybe from a purely commercial perspective, maybe there's some aspect of your product marketing scenario that is communicative in nature, and you have to communicate the importance of this particular tool to a non-expert. Let's say you're communicating to an IT department about something that they're going to have to work with, but really you're talking about a piece of equipment that's sitting in a microbiology lab. The IT group needs to understand certain information. They need to retain it, but you're not really selling to them directly. Education provides frameworks for understanding, and often we think of education as being tied to curricula, specific skill building, accreditation, certificate programs. And, marketing, meanwhile, hopefully, if it's good, creates an emotional connection and motivates action. So companies need to leverage all three of these because they serve different purposes. So communication builds the trust that you need so that the IT department isn't, stepping in the middle of your decision-making process with a big, nope, you're not SOC 3 compliant. Therefore, we're not even going to talk to you and we're going to just not let this buy process move forward at all, right? That can happen if you haven't properly communicated around your science. Education builds competence. So very often when we're trying to sell a complex tool in a complex organization with multiple people in that buying process, you're identifying your champions and you're equipping them with tools that they can use to educate others in their decision-making process. They really truly understand why this tool, for example, is important to that organization. And then marketing, of course, drives the adoption. So it's that emotional connection, it's the promotion that you're doing, it's the pricing, it's that specific problem that tool solves and how it's differentiated. And all of these three, communication pathways create that well-rounded approach that companies can use to sell more product ultimately, but really be more mission-driven and communicate. Now, I've been using these examples of science communication, education, and marketing within a sales process because they're all very important. But you can broaden this out a step further, right? So if you are a small space tech startup in Maine, of which there are several, I know, because they can knock on the venture fund.
Shout out to Maine.
Shout out to Maine and the burgeoning space tech market. But, if you're a company from Maine with a piece of space technology, you can't just try to sell your tech to investors or to potential buyers. You're really involved in building an ecosystem where your company is based because you have to. You have to educate people who are going to fund you, who are going to give you the tax breaks and incentives that you need to develop manufacturing capacity. There's just so much more to selling science for an organization than the quarterly revenue goals attached to one product.
That seems very relevant to some of the organizations I talk to. For example, the state organizations like that, biotechnology industry groups in each state that are trying to build those ecosystems. And when you mentioned space tech, I've done a couple of podcasts with Varda Space Industries down in LA, and there's definitely an ecosystem around there. And I think there is value in having those people kind of concentrated. I mean, just for all the people you have to talk to, investors, suppliers, and so on, it's more efficient for everybody to be sort of localized. So
It can be. It can be. And, and I say that running a distributed company, like we've been distributed since pre-COVID, all our staff is all over the world, our clients are all over the world. But as somebody who's very involved in regional economic development activities, I'm absolutely supportive of these innovation clusters, especially for younger scientists, or if you're running your first spin out company and you've spun out from a research organization or you're trying to, that infrastructure that exists with just vivarium space that's fractional and for rent, or, just things that you could not afford to purchase that, or in that no venture capital fund should be funding de novo for you. You really do have to be in certain locations for those things. But what's really interesting is we used to think, especially for biotech, of these areas being Boston, Cambridge, San Diego, maybe a little bit in LA, San Francisco, of course, maybe New York. But now we're seeing all of these very specific clusters around medtech, Minneapolis, around AI and biotherapeutic development, right? And so genetic engineering, and you're starting to see the clusters really spread out throughout the country. And that's really what we want to see, not just in the US, but of course, internationally. So I'm really supportive of online environments, webinars, social networking, podcasts like this to bring communities internationally together. But I am really supportive of the local regional clusters, and I'm glad to see those proliferate more broadly.
Yeah, and that's awesome. Yeah, but I want to go back now even further to the one thing that you said that really stood out to me about marketing creates connection. And the whole emotional thing there, which I know many people are continually trying to drive home, but I don't think we can say it enough. And maybe what I really like about it is how you separated it from education and communication.
Yeah.
And I mean, those can be components, but marketing is the emotional component of getting people to think, I'm interested in this. I like what they're doing. I believe in what they're doing. These are people I would like to work with.
Exactly. And you know how that is, right? Synergistically, if you're having a conversation about a particular tool, and it's very obvious to the clinician you're speaking with just how powerful this tool could be for their practice, that's almost immediately apparent. And it comes from making that emotional connection, whether it's you as the individual, doing the marketing or the selling to that clinician, or if it's a little bit more general and making the impact of this tool so relevant to that clinician's practice, just as an example, since we're on the life sciences topic.
Yeah, no, that's good. All right, let's talk about a company that might be considering and investing in science communication and education, maybe beyond their marketing connection activities. What are some low-cost, high-impact ways to increase public engagement with their science and make it worthwhile for them, of course?
Sure. So I wouldn't tell anyone to do anything that I wouldn't do myself. So we'll start there. And actually, I'll give a couple of examples. The first that I think is just one of the easiest and most impactful way that if you're small, let's just say you're small because you've never invested in science education or communication efforts. So we're not talking about a Pfizer of the world. We're talking about maybe a spin-out company or somebody who's maybe in their B or their C round from a venture financing perspective. And maybe they're trying to justify science education or science communication efforts to their investors or to some other decision maker or set of decision makers. I always say fail fast, fail cheap, which I can't take credit for. I think a guy named Doug Hall, he used to teach this innovation engineering curriculum back 20 years ago. I took the course from him, and smart guy. But he always said fail fast, fail cheap. And I still like that method, and I use it a lot with clients today, especially when you're developing strategies. So can you pick a science communication or education project that is relatively confined, meaning it's time bound, maybe it's a 30, 45, or 60-day project end. Maybe there's a small budget, and you just pick a very particular marketing channel to focus on. So let's say just as an example of a high impact, typically low time commitment activity, have your CEO or your chief science officer start a LinkedIn blog and help them with that. So maybe it's as simple as you write it for the CEO. You're the ghostwriter. I mean, we do this all the time for companies, right? Most content isn't written by the CEO or the CSO, and it really can't be. Those people are focused on too many high value, important things to be doing a lot of their own writing unless it's a passion for them. So help them get started. Create the editorial calendar for the month, draft the content, give them enough time to edit, work with their assistants or whoever to make sure that there are no blocks, get it published and out there, track the results. And the reason I also love that is it sort of focuses a little bit on ego of the C-levels, which can be really important because they're the talking heads that you sort of want to put out into the world anyway. They are the experts. But it also typically feeds into their broader career goals. If you're a chief science officer or the CEO of a biotech startup, you want to be making a name for yourself so that you can get the funding or the meetings for the funding that you're going to need long term so that you can attract the right talent to your organization and so on and so forth. So helping build a platform for your C-level leadership can be one of the most impactful ways that you can start communicating and educating about science without feeling like you're just always selling it, while also building the mission of your company in a very public forum. So I say LinkedIn, blog, C-levels, that's a great place to start. You can expand from that. The natural expansion, I think, would be booking your C-levels on podcasts. I can't emphasize just how important it is to have natural conversations about the topics that are near and dear to that organization's mission and experimenting with that messaging in real time. And it can be a great opportunity, a great gateway, podcasting as well as the blog, to getting those C-levels on panels at important conferences and so on. So really just by starting small with sort of a fail fast, fail cheap project, if you can demonstrate the value, then of course it can lead to all of these other opportunities and build your science, communication, education, and marketing platform for your organization from there.
Yeah, of course, I love both of those ideas. I don't think enough CEOs of small companies are probably doing it.
Right.
And when you talk about getting on podcasts, it's helpful to get on more than one. I mean,
Yes.
you should come on mine, of course, but you should.
Absolutely.
And I think the value, besides all the things you listed there, or the time saver, is, and it might seem ridiculous, but you may be talking about the same sort of thing every time,
Sure.
but you're reaching a different group. And so it shouldn't take that much preparation beyond the first one or two to go, oh, I know what we're going to do,
Exactly.
and so on. And then in terms of, I mean, what I've done with a few people is, you interview them for a podcast, you write it up, you chop it up into little pieces, you put it out, and that doesn't take much time. So, for example.
Yes, you have
And
content that lives forever and that can be chopped up into micro content and served on different platforms, which then fuels basically experiments in marketing on an iterative basis, whether you're testing new channels, testing new messages, calls to action, whatever you may be, you have to have some content to work from. So why not get your CEO on some podcasts?
Right. Yeah, great idea. Let's talk about early science education and STEM programs.
Yeah, sure.
So those are clearly important to both of us. How do you believe early exposure to science can shape the next generation of, I'm going to say, rock stars? Why companies should actively support those initiatives?
I think that every company should be supporting STEM as well as the arts education. They're both so important. They're not at all diametrically opposed. They're completely united. High Touch supports a couple of science competitions each year. Back years ago, I worked at the University of Maine for the offshore wind program. I was a program manager there. And one of my areas of expertise was education and outreach. We didn't call it marketing because it was for a nonprofit research institute. But we started the Windstorm Challenge, which was a program across the state of Maine that partnered with science and mathematics classrooms in elementary, middle, and high school age groups, that gave any classroom or after-school program that signed up a kit to essentially help them develop a floating offshore wind turbine. And then they came to a one-day event at the University of Maine. We bussed in, 1,000 students or more from all over the states, and they tested their inventions in a wind wave tank, which was essentially a pool with a big wave-making device that some of our engineering students had developed. And we used, they were video iPods at the time. I don't even know if you can get them anymore, but they have pretty advanced accelerometers in them. So we put them in the tops of the turbines, and we were actually displaying like the pitch and yaw and all of these different factors on a screen, so that as the device was being tested, all of those different factors were being recorded, sent to a screen. And then the students had to pitch their business plan for why their turbine design was the best for Maine's offshore communities. So the competition had this business entrepreneurship component, and then of course had the scientific and testing component. And I'm happy to say that this program is still running today. I haven't been involved outside of sponsoring for the last 10 years or so, but it's still going every year, and it's supporting more and more students. And because of this program and others like it, most classrooms in the state of Maine, and public schools anyway, have pretty good access to resources about the offshore wind industry, which is a major industry that the state of Maine is trying to develop over the next 20, 30, 40 years. So many of these students today who are participating in these challenges will be employed by that industry going forward, because it's going to be one of the largest employers in the state of Maine in just a few years. And so when we look at how early exposure can affect kids, they might not even be thinking about some of these industries, or that there are careers in X, Y, or Z. I grew up in a small town in Maine. I certainly didn't know that there were all of these different careers, just in benchtop science. I had no idea. And I was from a pretty educated family and went to good schools. You just don't get the same exposure without having the corporate perspective really helping explain to students and their educators, like their parents and teachers, what are jobs like in science actually like? What do you actually do? What are the problems you're really trying to solve? Because not everyone's building a spaceship to get to Mars. And the other things that we see on like Good Morning America and Neil deGrasse Tyson's podcast, a lot of people are solving very specific, very nuanced problems. And I think that STEAM and STEM programs just really help expose students to the realities of what they are, so that they're keeping them in mind and becoming better educated as a result for you eventually. But they also kind of help develop a society that is more science friendly, more science literate, which is only going to be helpful for every vaccine or therapeutic company out there, every space tech company, every climate tech company. It's a lot easier if you can communicate with people who have at least a baseline understanding of your industry or field. So you're not scary.
There are so many things in there. So one, the economic development part for your state, to say this is an area where we have an opportunity and we need to start getting people excited about the idea of offshore wind turbines, starting in school and giving them hands-on, right?
Yeah.
And then and of course the students themselves, and then the companies that will employ them. But also every other company in science. You might feel like you're pulling the load for every other company, but everybody should be participating in a way that trust in one area of science spills over into creating trust in other areas. And really, that's the thing we really need to do, is get more people to see, like, these things didn't come from nowhere.
It's very true.
There is nothing you do what we're doing right here, talking remotely on a computer, which would have been a dream when I was a kid. I mean, we used to joke about it. Oh, yeah, I'm going to call somebody up and see them on the screen. No way.
Right.
Right?
Right. No, it's incredible. And like when you think about, I mean, the tech evolution in the 80s, for example, I mean, so much of that happened in regional clusters, some of the things that we're talking about. And that's why it was so isolated. We have all of this technology to leverage. We don't even have to buy expensive textbooks for classrooms anymore. I mean, so much of our science education could be changed to create this more nuanced level of, higher level and nuanced level of science literacy across our population.
I want to ask you about, I mean, this has sort of been the behind all this conversation, how we take for granted all these science things, our society has become so advanced and maybe the change is so rapid that, oh, of course I can call anybody in the world from the thing in my pocket.
Right.
And how do we overcome that and get people excited again? And maybe, I mean, that's what this whole conversation has been about. But if you have some secret sauce to pour on the finish here, that's awesome.
You know, I wish I had the magic bullet. I think that it's honestly people like us, Chris, people like, there are so many great science educators and communicators out there. I think doing a better job of celebrating those successes. I think that even if you are not a company I talked about the Windstorm Challenge in the state of Maine just because it's one that's near and dear to my heart. But to your point, just because you're not in the offshore wind industry today does not mean that you can't be supportive of STEM programs like that in your states. And if you want to be directly, just because it's easier, I think, for most marketing or corporate development teams to sell up the chain, there are so many great organizations in California. You've got California Life Sciences, you've got Biocom, who does amazing work in STEM. So, I mean, really figuring out who those other people like you are in your particular industry, space tech, climate tech, whatever it is, and then working with them, because probably there are people doing what you want to do, but maybe there's something you can add to it. Maybe you're that talking head they need. Maybe you are that person who really loves kids, and just you interacting with 1,000 kids a year just by going to a couple different classrooms can make a huge difference in literally 1,000 kids a year's lives. And it's something that is just a couple afternoons for the average person. So I think that there are ways that we can all get involved. And I don't want to lose count of the fact that there are some people doing some great work in this field already. And anything we can do to be supportive of those efforts, I think, is just going to help, the rising tide lifts all boats sort of thing.
Nice. Elizabeth Chabe, I want to thank you so much for all of that. This conversation has been a blast.
Awesome.
And I also want to compliment you on your beautiful background where there are actually live butterflies
Yeah.
flying around. That's a first. Maybe all-time winner on LSMR for backgrounds, I am sure.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for having me, Chris. Hopefully we can continue this conversation another time, but this has been great.
Absolutely. Hey, if you're still listening, that tells me you enjoyed the podcast. But don't tell me, tell your friends, and I'll be back soon with another episode. Okay, you can tell me too. Send an email, chris@lifesciencemarketingradio.com. Bye-bye.